Well, welcome everybody. I'm David Mattis. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools. It's a pleasure for you to join us this afternoon for our webinar, Best Practices for Board Treasurers. So thanks so much for taking some time to take a look at this important topic. Few items of housekeeping before we get going. First, Rick Kellogg was supposed to join us today, but he has had something come up on his calendar, so he's not going to be with us. If he's able to join us halfway through, he will, but just wanted to make that announcement before we get started. Second, the recording of this webinar will be available in the webinar library, as will a copy of the slides. The slides will be available in the document library. You'll need your login credentials to access both of those pages. And if you need to recover your login credentials, or you have questions about how to access the webinar library or the document library, if you'll just give Pat Blevins a call in our main office, she'll make sure that you have access to both of those things. The Q&A box, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. If you will click on that button, it'll open up the Q&A dialog, and that will be the way you can ask questions. Feel free to use that as questions pop up, points of clarification that you need. Make sure to type those into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get all of the questions answered today. And then finally, the chat window is also available. It's a good way for you to, if you want to share resources, or if you have some comments that you want to share with all the participants, you can use the chat box for that as well. So those are the housekeeping items. Welcome again to everybody. I'm going to turn it over to our Director of Professional Development, Mary Catherine Duffy. Mary Catherine, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, folks. We're glad to have everyone here. This is a really important webinar, Best Practices for Board Treasurers. It's something that we all need, and so I'm looking forward to sharing some information with you. And regarding the information, and Rick, a lot of this information that you're going to see today has been developed from Rick and just his knowledge and wisdom over the years. So if he can join us, great, but just know that him not being here doesn't mean you won't get his wisdom, I can assure you. So let's go ahead and begin today just talking about what we're going to cover. There are three areas that I'd like to touch on today. And the first is the role of the board treasurer for those people who are new at this role. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of what you should be looking at as your role. The second thing is the best operating practices for good financial management. I think as a board treasurer, it's kind of one of the duties that you have to make sure that your school is operating under best practice. And then finally, ways or keys for successful relationships between the board treasurer and the head. This is a really critical relationship in the life of a school, and we want to be sure that you know how to best develop that. So if we have people on this webinar that are heads, or we have treasurers, or even if we have board chairs, this is a really important relationship that you learn how to develop. So let's start out. You have just been elected board treasurer, and it's an important job, but sometimes we get elected to things and we say, well, what's my role? What am I supposed to be doing? So we're gonna start at that point with the role of the board treasurer. So there are four basic areas that I would like to talk about today that the role of the board treasurer needs to look at. And the first one is just the chairmanship of the finance committee. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about the finance committee, but one of the biggest roles that you will find is that you are the chairman of the finance committee. And with that comes some responsibility around how committee meetings are operated, the things that you do in those committee meetings. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Another role that is critical is the assistance with the development of the budget, the school budget. And notice I did not say you are in charge of developing the school budget. I said you are the assistant as the budget is being developed. And so being a part of that conversation is going to be another role that you have. Ensuring regular review and reporting. We're going to go into detail about what that looks like. And finally, ensuring the best practice in school operations. So we want to, as a board treasurer, we want to make sure that we're going to follow those best practices and that our school is doing those things. So let's talk about the finance committee for just a minute. So as the chairman of the finance committee, one of the biggest things that you do is not only to ensure the finance committee meetings, but probably work with the head of school to get those calendared, make sure that they take place, and that you chair them. Serving as the chair of the finance committee, you work with the board, the head of the school, to set the agenda for those. Depending on kind of where you are in your budget year, it's going to determine the agenda. But for example, if you are in January, we're going to talk about this in just a minute, but if you're in January, then you're going to probably have on your agenda that you're going to be working on the development of a preliminary budget. Or if you are in July, you're working probably closer to the final budget that's going to be presented. So working with the board to set the agenda for those regular finance meetings is one of the things that you do. Representing the board and ensuring that best practices of financial management are taking place in the school. What this means for me is that the board counts on you to make sure that the best practices are taking place, and that you're overseeing that and making sure that those things are taking place. And that you're representing the board in that respect. You aren't doing the best practices. Those are operational. That's something we talk a lot about when it comes to the role of board members, but you are representing the board and making sure that that takes place. One of the things that we run into often is around the idea of minutes at the finance committee meetings. And, oftentimes we take board minutes and we have a secretary of the board and we take those minutes, but you should also be taking minutes at the finance committee meetings, and those minutes should be kept as a matter of record. This is something that we look for when we come for a 10-year accreditation visit. We look into the documents in adherence to standards, and we look to see that the finance committee not only is meeting, but that they're documenting those meetings with minutes, and that those minutes are in somewhere in the record so that they're easily found. And I think that's important too, primarily because decisions are made in the finance committee that sometimes we forget. What did we say last time? And so it's written down. Who should do this? I don't know that it really matters. We don't typically have a person on the finance committee that's also the secretary. So you could have the chairman of that committee the board treasurer can just ask somebody on the committee to take those notes and take those minutes. And but it's important that those take place. I also want to touch on a little bit about who should sit on this committee. It really kind of depends on what the bylaws of the board say, but oftentimes it's a board chair. It's obviously the treasurer who would chair that finance committee. It can be people that are on the committee, on the board, that are finance oriented, maybe business owners, maybe bankers. It should probably be the bookkeeper or the business manager should probably serve a role on that committee. We've talked a little bit in the past about whether this should be somebody that's not a board member. Oftentimes we have committees on our boards where we'll have an outside person that's not a board member attending or being on a committee. But the finance committee is not something that we normally see with that. Now, I will say that when I was in charge of a school, there were some years that I had a vestry liaison that was helpful. Primarily, those were the years where we were raising money and doing capital campaigns. So it was helpful to have that. And the person I had was a super good business person that offered a different perspective. So that can take place, but generally those are the people that would serve on a finance committee. So let's do a poll question here. And we want to ask you, does your school have a board finance committee that meets monthly? So we're going to ask you to answer that question, and we're going to see how it rolls out.
So the poll's open. So just click yes or no. We'll leave it open for a few more seconds. Responses are starting to come in. Okay, last call. Okay, let's take a look.
Excellent. Okay, so we see that 88% of our attendees have already have a finance committee and they meet every month. Uh, there are some schools that don't necessarily always meet every month. Maybe they meet every 6 weeks if they're a smaller school or whatever, but we do recommend that not only do you have that committee, but it meets monthly. Oftentimes it'll meet right before the board meeting so that if there's anything that needs to be done at that board meeting that you can get that done. So let's go to the next role, which is the assisting in the development of a school budget. And this is a really important part of the role because it's important that the head of school and the business manager have some outside perspective as they begin to develop the budget. Of course, we're going to talk a little bit in just a second about a calendar or how you might develop a budget. And we talk really in detail about that in a webinar down the road that we have called the Budgeting and the Financial Dashboard. And that's going to be one where we can go into detail about budgeting. But as the school head and the business manager begin to develop a budget, it's critical that the board treasurer be involved in that. So the business manager should participate in that planning too, because the business manager oftentimes will see the day-to-day stuff and the head of school does too, but not in detail like the business manager. So all of those perspectives, I think, play a really important role in developing a budget. So what does that look like? Well, so typically in a calendar year, a lot of times business owners work on a fiscal year of January to December, but remember that schools work typically either on a July to June year, sometimes June to May, sometimes August to July, but it's more of a school year type of budget. So this calendar is based on that type of thinking. So September and October, I would be looking at previous and current year budgets. We would be assessing enrollment trends and establishing a conservative enrollment goal for the coming year. Now, some people are going to look at that and go, gosh, why are we starting in September and October? Because it takes a long time to gather information and to continually try to make good decisions. And you have to have some decisions made by January. So that's why we start in September and October, reviewing all of the information, working with trends. What have we done in the past? Looking at our dashboard, looking at all the different things that we've done and kind of setting an enrollment goal. November is when I would begin to create a preliminary budget with my business manager and my treasurer. I would consider all kinds of things that we've been gathering in September and October, and I would begin to think about a recommendation to the board. And what we're doing is we're looking to recommend to the board about tuition and compensation. We want to take a look at what is our tuition going to be next year? What is our compensation going to be next year? December is when the finance committee would present a recommendation and the board would approve that for tuition and compensation. So that's why the November time period is really critical, because you can spend time in your finance committee doing that work and working with the numbers and hashing out ideas and that sort of thing. So September through November is kind of when we're doing that.
All right, Kath, let me ask a follow-up question with regards to compensation. So the board approves the tuition. That's a set dollar amount. Talk to us more about what you mean by the board approving compensation, because I don't want to make it sound as if the board is setting individual salaries.
That's correct. You're not. Rick and I talked about this just recently. And one of the things that he's talking about there is really more about what is the big number that we think we're going to spend. Now, remember that this is a preliminary budget. So if I know, after looking at my enrollment trends, if I know that I'm going to increase my 4-year-old class by 1 section, well, then I need to make sure that there's compensation in there for that. Or if I know that my strategic plan calls for the addition of another administrator, or it calls for the addition of an additional coach, that's where we're talking about big picture compensation. We're certainly not talking about how much is the admissions officer going to make.
Right. Or talking about the strategic plan of doing a 3%
Correct.
increase across the board.
Correct.
making those dollars available, then the head of school would actually administer
That's
that
correct.
that pool of money individually to her or his staff.
That's correct. So January, February is when we are continuing the work on the preliminary budget. We're watching the re-enrollment numbers. Many of our schools are issuing contracts for the next school year in January and February. We are watching those re-enrollments come back in. March and April is when we take those actual numbers and we put them into a preliminary budget. We've decided, figured out the compensation already, and typically a March or April preliminary budget is approved. And then May, June, and July, we're just watching that enrollment. If enrollment goes down, we may have to make some budget cuts. If enrollment's going up and we need to add a class, or we need to add a teaching assistant, or we need to add something, then that's when we're going to be working on that. After that's all finished and we know that we've got the right number and we know we've got a good budget, then we can present that in August for approval to the board. So that's kind of a sample budgeting calendar. I do want to say again that if you want more detail on that, we will do it. We will be doing a good 2-hour webinar on that very topic. I believe it's going to be in November.
Let's take a couple of questions. We've got a few. First question was about benchmarking salaries. I'm going to hold that to the end because I've got a few comments about that, about benchmarking salaries. What's the recommended process for considering a salary change for the head of school? Would you like to talk about that, Mary Catherine?
Well, typically that's going to be separate and above other compensation. So if you are working, it kind of depends on where you are in your contract. Obviously, if you want to amend that contract and change the salary, the board has the ability to do that. I would say that that's definitely separate and apart from compensation, because the head of school salary should be negotiated individually. And so when it comes to that, if the contract allows, I don't see a reason that you can't renegotiate a contract at any point.
Yeah, it's going to depend on what the term of the contract is. Sometimes head of school contracts include a percentage increase every year. Sometimes head of school contracts say that salary will be adjusted annually based on performance evaluation. And if that's the case, then it would be part of the discussion when the board is doing its head of school evaluation. And would be, supervised by the head support and evaluation committee if you have one, or the executive council, whoever is tasked with doing the head support and evaluation piece. So it's obviously, it's part of the budget, obviously. Normally those conversations also take place at a different time for when you're
Correct.
doing this. So, ideally you've had those conversations in the spring for the upcoming year, if that makes sense. So when you're doing the budget for the upcoming year, you can plug that number in. But ideally you've had those conversations before you get into crafting the budget for the following year, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And those are not conversations that typically would happen in a finance committee meeting.
Correct.
Those are conversations that would be had in an executive committee meeting or a head support and evaluation committee meeting.
Correct.
Good question. Okay, so let's talk about reviewing and reporting. So one of the roles that we want to talk about is the reviewing of the financials of the school and looking for accounting financial errors. I think this is important because, remember, as a board member, it's your role to kind of oversee things, and it's helpful when you're looking at the financials regularly that you can find things that maybe, people are people, they're going to make mistakes. And so it's nice to have a next eye to go, hey, this line item doesn't make sense. Tell me more about that. And so I think that reviewing with the head of the school or the business manager is helpful. It's also important to that you prepare and present a treasurer report at monthly board meetings. So every single board meeting, I would encourage you to be presenting a report to that board, to the board about the financials. Now, do you have to prepare it? Yes. And what I mean by that is that you get the data from the business officer, or you get the data from the head of school, and then you're putting together how you are going to present. I think it's really important too that when you present that you make it something that people who are not necessarily financial people can understand. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but when you prepare that report every month, that it be something that people can read and understand and ask questions about. And then the final one, we're going to talk more detail later, is about ensuring that there's an annual or an external audit or review. So what is regular financial review for a school? Well, first of all, the head of the school and the business manager should regularly be reviewing financials. The head of school and the business manager absolutely should know kind of what you're dealing with at all times. One of the areas that we see often is the issue of a head of school that is not super financially savvy. We talked about this. We've talked about this several times in different webinars about a head of school who comes into their position and they might be super great at curriculum and super great at people and all kinds of things, but they don't know, they're not accountants. That's not what they went to school for. So it's critical that if a head of school needs that training, that the board find ways to give that training. It's just, it just matters, because they can't meet with the business manager and review financials if they don't understand what they're reading. What are the financials that we look at? We look at P&Ls, we look at a balance sheet. I love the idea of the board treasurer coming up with a one sheet type of dashboard that can be presented each month rather than just full financials, because not everybody can read a financial statement. And I've seen schools where they did a one-page financial dashboard that had charts and things that really were kind of layperson friendly. And I love that. The second way that we do financial review is that the finance committee, led by the board treasurer, is reviewing those financials every month at their finance meeting. So we start with the head of school and business manager watching, and then we come to the finance meeting, and the finance committee is reviewing them and asking questions. I always found that to be super helpful, because my business manager and I would look at something and we would review, and then we would go to the finance committee prepared for people to find things that we had missed or ask questions about things that they didn't understand. And I like that, because that's accountability and it's collaboration. And then finally, the reviewing by the treasurer to the school board every single month. And what that needs to happen there is that the treasurer needs to create an environment in which people can ask questions, because not every person on the board is a financial person. And but every person on the board has the fiduciary responsibility to the school. And so it's really, I would love to see every school board be a safe place in which they can ask questions. And I would love to see every board treasurer be a coach or a teacher when it comes to teaching people how to read financials and what to look for. So let's go next to the idea of ensuring best practice in school financial operations. And this is something we talk about a lot, about what does it look like to have best practices? What are those best practices? I want to remind all of our people here that are not necessarily in the school business for their day-to-day work, that a school operates oftentimes very similar to businesses, but it's oftentimes a very unique business entity. And it's really important that as you walk through kind of the idea of school as a business, that you understand that there are certain things that we do to establish best practice, but they may not always look like your business. And I think that's something that we run into sometimes with accountants that serve as treasurers, or business owners that serve as treasurers. The school business is a unique one, and there's lots that you bring to the table, but sometimes you can view it the wrong way, and that's not helpful. So,
ask this question, Mary Catherine. This is a great question. What training resources are available to increase financial savviness of a head?
Oh gosh. Well, I think you start, first of all, as much as possible with some of the webinars that we put out. I think they're pretty friendly to teaching about what things look like, best practices for operations, et cetera. I know that there are probably I know that there are some companies out there like Independent School Management offers some things that would be interesting. And I have seen some of their work. I've done some of their work and it's pretty good. I think sometimes what's really helpful is for there to be that training by the accountant or the board treasurer themselves to be able to, we don't need to offer we don't need to offer an accounting class to a head of school. What we need to do is sit down with the head of school and walk through, here's what a P&L looks like. And
Right.
here's what if you can attach it to your particular school, I think that's going to be a lot more helpful. If you don't feel comfortable with that, surely there's somebody in your community that would be a good resource to teach your head of school the basics of reading a balance sheet and a P&L and what a dashboard would look like. I think that would be where I would begin. I would begin with some of our webinars, and then I would begin with also concurrently working individually with the head of school. Maybe there's a group of people on the finance committee that could do that.
Yeah, I think so. I also like the resources that NBOA puts out.
Yeah.
That stands for the National Business Officers Association. A lot of their resources may be more tactical than the average head of school needs, but they've got some pretty good resources on best practices. If you look at our vital signs or sign up for our vital signs webinar, we have a whole set of vital signs that focus on the financial operations of a school. So that's another great resource. Mm-hmm. If it's a new head of school or a relatively new head of school, then I'd recommend our New Heads University, because we spend a lot of time in NHU covering what does the head of school need to know to be savvy. The head of school doesn't need an MBA. The head of school doesn't need to be a CPA necessarily, but there are a few fundamental things that every head of school does need to be able to follow. And then of course, if you want to contact me, if you have some specific questions or looking for any specific resources, feel free to drop me a note as well.
Yeah, one of the things that Rick Kellogg used to always do, he did a couple of breakout sessions at some of our heads things with the head of schools. And one of the things that he always said to them is you may not know what you're doing, but you're still held to the standard of running a business. And so it's really important that if you feel that you need that training, that you ask for it. And so, and I would say the same is true for the board. If the board feels that that training is needed, they need to do whatever they can do to get that training there. Okay, so let's talk about just a few best practices for financial operations. And there are some that I'm going to talk more about, but I want to go through these very quickly. The first is to incorporate the school as a legal entity. Now, we know that some dioceses do not allow this, but if this is possible, this is a best practice to make sure that the school is separately incorporated in the instance that it is a parochial school. Number two, establish clear lines of authority. So what this talks about is just the idea that the vestry empowers the school board. The school board hires the head of school, and the head of school manages the budget and oversees operations. A business officer is an employee of the head of school. Now, why am I saying that? Why is that important? Well, that's important because the board treasurer oftentimes will work with the business officer on how to do some accounting things. But it's critical to remember that the directives that the business officer are to follow should come from the head of school and not from a board treasurer, because the board treasurer is a board member, and that can get muddled, that clear lines of authority. Some of the things that we see oftentimes in transition is when you've got transition between heads, or you've got a situation where a head had to leave quickly, and you'll have a board member that steps up and will help work with the business manager to do the finances. And that can happen, and it's sometimes necessary. But once there's a head of school in place, the lines of authority need to go back and be back like the best practice is, because it's just important that to know that the treasurer is not an operational person. The board treasurer sees the bigger picture, and the head of school does the operations. So number three, this goes back a little bit to the parochial school, separate accounting between the church and the school. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. We want to ensure that we have competent accounting. That's absolutely critical. So be sure that the person that's doing the review or the audit is competent. Ensuring financial transparency. So the board should review the financial reports monthly. We just talked about that. And that they should see an audit every year or the review every year, and that should be presented. So more best practices, high quality bookkeeping. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about what that looks like. Following a calendar for the budgeting process. We just kind of went through that. The idea of making sure that you're following the calendar and that you're doing it. They're not just kind of coming up and going, oh my gosh, we don't have a budget for next year. Regular financial review. We're going to talk more about that with the audit. Having a risk management plan. There is more to this as you talk about, when you talk about the idea of making sure that all of everything's in place with safety protocols and policies in place that mitigate risk. Especially right now, we see a lot of this needs to be in place because of COVID. The idea of making sure that the policies in place to keep everyone safe. Insurance is part of this. So the best practices, you want to make sure that your school has has a risk management plan and that you've thought through all of that. Having a shared use agreement between the church and the school is another best practice. Having a PPRRSM account, we call that a PRISM account. It's a short acronym for Provision for Plant Replacement, Renewal, and Special Maintenance. For me, that was just the idea of at my house, if I know I'm going to run out, I need to eventually replace a 15-year air conditioner, that I've put aside money to do that. And then finally, having policies in place around the special funds that are controlled by the board, making sure that all of the special accounts, all of the things like the 4th grade account or the 5th grade account or PALS or whatever parent association you have, that stuff is all controlled by the board and not by particular individuals. Okay, so we have another poll question here. Is the school's accounting separate from the church's accounting? We'd like to know if this is something you're running into. If you're a parochial school, is your school's accounting or your books separate? Yes, no, or NA, we're a non-parochial school.
And again, we're not getting into the situation of separate books with one accountant for both church and school. We referenced that, but we're talking specifically about the accounting. So yes, no, or NA if you're in non-parochial school, which means you're not attached to a parish. Give it another couple of seconds. Last call. Okay, let's take a look.
Okay, great. Oh, that's great news. Always like to see that we've had that separate accounting. So that's important because we have a couple of reasons. Number one, we have a standard that says that the school board oversees the funds of the school, and that can't take place if funds are not separate. So that's why that's number one important. And it's also just best practice that the vestry has given power to the school board to steward the finances of the school. Now, I want to touch on something that I do think is really important as well. Oftentimes, especially we see this in our smaller environments, we'll have a school where you have separate books, but you have an individual that does both the books. So sometimes that will be a scenario where you have a church business person operates the financials and operates the books for both the church and the school. We would offer to you that that's not best practice, that the best practice is for each entity to have their own person and their own books. Now, obviously, there is, in a parochial school relationship, there is a need for accountability that the school has to the church. But to have your own separate books is actually best practice. And it's important also because, going back to the idea of the lines of authority, if my books are being done and worked on by someone that's not my employee, that can be tricky. And so it's important as a head of school that you have an employee that is doing the work and the bookkeeping and the accounting for you. Okay, so let's talk about what does high quality bookkeeping look like? And these may be things that everybody already knows to do, but sometimes we'll run across somebody who doesn't realize this. So we've got 8 different things. There are more, but these are the 8 that I wanted to really focus on. The first one is that cash is registered as soon as it arrives. And, you know, we know that in a school, there are all kinds of opportunities for cash to be given through backpacks and that sort of thing. And so it's critical that as cash is given, that it's registered and that there be some sort of documentation given that it was registered. Number 2, that physical assets are registered and kept up to date. You know, the schools have all kinds of physical assets that are really valuable. And it's important that you know that you have 15 laptop computers and the next year you only had 14. What happened to that one? That's really important. And that when there's an audit, when the audit comes up, that information is usually given. Bank statements that are reconciled monthly, you know, that's an area that's just good financial practice. 2-party signatures that are required on all checks. One of the things that Rick talks about often is that everything you can do to mitigate opportunities for bad behavior, you should do. And having 2-party signatures is one of the ways that that helps just keep everybody accountable. And it's also protection, truthfully. It's protection for the business manager. It's protection for the head of school, and just good practice. Another good practice that I think sometimes I worry that this is not happening as often as it should is the idea of accounting files being backed up. You should be backing this up daily. You should be backing all your files up daily. We would recommend that you also back them up off site, so that if it's not just you've backed it up and stuck it in a lockbox in a closet, that if the God forbid the school burned down, that they would have been off site as well. The more you can back up, the better, and the daily helps you, because when things go awry, and sometimes they do, you're not in a bad position. The head of school approving checks over a defined amount. This is dependent on each school is going to offer their own policy on this. The board should have financial policies that speak to both the 2-party signatures and the head of school approving checks. And so that's important that you have policies in place for that, that your invoices and your check stubs are kept together in vendor files, that there are no opportunities for fake vendors or anything like that that would be an opportunity for fraud. So these are just some of the ways in which you can make sure that your bookkeeping is high quality.
Let me jump in. We've got a great question about financial controls. What about financial controls? Control calendars, control catalog, delegation of authority, separation of duties, et cetera. So that's one of the reasons why we require our schools to have an audit every year. So an audit, as opposed to a review, is going to include a deep dive into some of these controls and some of these systems that you've referenced. So we don't have specific definitions about what we consider to be an appropriate separation of duties. And lots of times different auditors will come down with different perspectives on that as well. Control seems to be an issue, or separation of authority, separation of duties rather, seems to sometimes be an issue in some of our smaller schools, really even some of our medium-sized schools, just because we don't have a corporate structure where we've got lots of different people. Lots of times there really is one person, the business officer, and occasionally the head, that are doing some of these bookkeeping tasks. So separation can be a little bit of a challenge, but it's a great question. But really, that's why we require our schools to have an audit, because the auditors, when you're going through that process, will provide really rich feedback on whether or not your current system is meeting what they would expect to be necessary for separation of duties.
Yeah, and one thing that I would also offer is that the board can do is that you should have financial policies in place in your board book. There should be specific financial policies that the board has approved, and those are part of where you find controls and things that, what do you expect? You know, we expect on how we handle donations, how we handle checks, how we handle things outside of the budget. All of that stuff should be, that's one way. And I would also say that, speaking to David's position of the smaller schools having, sometimes one one business manager, and that's oftentimes the case. And it does make for a more difficult situation, because a lot of what we do in the business office is confidential. And in a smaller school, sometimes smaller schools are the hardest hit in that, because the smaller schools, everyone knows everything. And so you can't just say, oh, I'm going to let the secretary in the early childhood area take all the donations for annual fund, because some of those might be confidential. And it's hard. It's a little bit gray at times. And so we run into that a little bit with auditors. And, but I think the more, solid policies you have in place, that the board has put together, the better that you're going to be in that.
And good auditors are a resource on those kinds of
Right.
things. I mean, the association, for example, we're a small team. There's 4 of us, so we have the same, question about how are we dividing tasks relating to finances, and we've got a great auditor who really helped us walk through some things and didn't just say you have to hire more people. Really worked with us on, well, what are some things you can do with the current structure to get a little better of a segregation of duties. So another reason to really have an audit every year, because within the context of the audit, that's where these kinds of conversations can happen, and you can come up with some creative solutions on how to address them.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of audits, let's go to, oh, sorry. I don't know what happened here. Sorry, guys. Let me come back to, I've lost myself. I hit a bat. There we go.
While you're rebooting, I'm going to answer another question. Okay. So here's another great question. Is there anything that documents what the overall relationship between the school and the church should be? For example, does the vestry approve or review the capital improvement plans? So great question. There's not a short answer to that. That goes to, are you a parochial school? Are you a diocesan school? Are you an independent school? Depending on your relationship, it's going to be a little bit different. I believe this question is coming from the Diocese of Texas. So where I would recommend you start is the Diocese of Texas, and the Schools Commission has a handbook. And that handbook does a pretty nice job of outlining what does it mean to be a parochial school. So the short answer is probably. Does the vestry review or approve a capital improvement? Yeah, probably, particularly if you're on the same campus, and especially if that capital improvement involves taking on debt. If you're in that situation, I can almost guarantee you it's going to require vestry approval if you're in a parochial environment. So that's where I would start. If I'm wrong about your diocese, then throw another question in the Q&A box and let me know what diocese you're from, because every diocese approaches that a little bit differently. But in the Diocese of Texas, the handbook for schools, which you can find on their website, is a great resource. David Dearman is the chair of the Schools Commission, so he's another great resource. From a standards perspective, what we expect has to do more with the relationship between the vestry and the board. We expect the vestry to fully delegate the authority to the board to be the governing body. Now, does that mean that the vestry has to approve everything? No. Does that mean the vestry has to approve certain things? Yes. So let me throw it to Mary Catherine and ask, you were in a parochial school, so let's play with that a little bit. What did the vestry approve with regard to the school in your context? Does that make sense?
Yeah, typically the vestry would approve our budget, and really they didn't approve it as much as they just saw it. I don't know that in our situation there was an actual vote to approve or maybe ratify, maybe. But we also did see, they saw the financials every single month. We sent the financials to the vestry every month. Definitely, if there was going to be any debt, the only debt that we ever went into was joint. So that wasn't really an issue. But if there was going to be something big, yeah, for sure, the vestry would be involved. And Diocese of West Texas doesn't have a particular, is not as particular as the Diocese of Texas, but I would say that we do expect for vestries to be aware and knowledgeable of the school's finances, and they do have the ability to step in if there's an issue.
The webinar, one final plug, the webinar, Whose School Is It Anyway? We talk about that question specifically in that webinar. It's just a plug for that event.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to a poll question and ask the question. We were talking about audits. Does your school have an annual review or audit by an independent firm? Yes or no?
Okay, I think that is launched. And again, Mary Catherine's going to get into the specifics of what, if you're an accredited school, we expect on that question. And answers are coming in. Last call, yes or no? And let's see what it looks like.
Great.
There we go.
Okay, so let's talk about reasons for having an audit. Sorry. So bookkeeping is complicated, and people can make mistakes. And that's one of the reasons we kind of talked about this earlier, but just auditors go in and they find things. They find areas in which maybe your bookkeeping needs to be better. They're an invaluable planning tool for the school. SAES does not, won't accredit without it. And so what David was talking about is that we did have this year, beginning this year, we have a standard that says that every year there must be an audit if you have revenue of more than $1 million. If you have it less than $1 million, you can alternate annually between an audit and review. But if your revenue is over $1 million, you must have an external independent certified public accounting firm audit you. And it's critical protection for the head of school, the board, and the vestry. You know, one of the things that Rick talks about often is that mistakes can cost many times what a review of the books would cost. And it's oftentimes people say, well, an audit's so expensive. I realize that, but it feels really important for me to say that as a nonprofit, the risk that you run in not having anybody outside look at your books, to me, is much larger than just budgeting the money for an audit. And of course, again, if you're a small school and you have revenue of less than $1 million, then you can alternate in between an audit and a review. And typically, I don't know about every community, but you know, you get a little bit of a price break on a review, but it's not huge. So I've seen many places where the review was just a little bit less than the audit. So we really encourage that. So the last thing I want to talk about, the roles in the role of the board treasurer, is the key to having a successful relationship between the treasurer and the head of school. This is such an important relationship, and this relationship is all about communication and collaboration. And what that means for me is that you are regularly communicating with each other, that you're meeting at least monthly to discuss the financials. If you have a head of school that is in need of some coaching on this in this area, that you would include that as part of what you're doing when you meet. That you insist on transparency and that you understand your role. Again, we talked a little bit earlier about a board treasurer role is not to go in and run the operations or give directives to the business manager, but it is to be collaborative with the head of school. And it may be that you say to your head of school, hey, I'd like to see the budget designed this way, or I'd like you to add a line item in the budget for this. That kind of stuff can be done. And then the head of school can go to the business manager and say, create a budget that has these things. The board treasurer would like to see these added to the financials or whatever. But the roles have to be clear. One of the things that Rick said that I think is really probably the most important point is this: the engagement of the treasurer's role is a crucial engagement to the school. So what I mean by that is that we realize that being a board treasurer is a big job. It's a big job. It takes a lot of time and energy. and but it can be harmful to the school if you don't take it seriously. And so an unengaged treasurer is not what we need. We need engagement. We need a person who's willing to communicate regularly with the head of school, that they're collaborating together on an annual budget, that they're working together with the head of school and the finance committee for good decision making. And then ultimately they're creating long-range financial plans for the school, and you're taking the lead on that. So the relationship between the two people really sets the stage for success or failure when it comes to the finances of the school. Now, one other thing that I would like to just kind of touch on before we go to Q&A that we've had questions about is the recruitment of, and I went through this, I went through this as well, the idea of how do I find a good treasurer? We find it sometimes hard to get people to commit to being a treasurer. And I think that the key is to really look for people within your community who are engaged already in your community, and ask them. I think there are ways that you can make it easier on a treasurer. One of the ways that you might consider doing that is we want longevity. I always wanted my treasurer to be the treasurer for a while, because that's consistency. They know the story of the school. They're going to, I don't have to every other year go back and tell the whole story of the last 5 years. And so the one way you can do that is that the treasurer might serve on the board for 3 years, and then they might stay as the treasurer but not be a board member. That would have to be a bylaws change if it's not in your bylaws to do it that way. But that was one way that we were able to keep people a little bit longer, because they didn't have to do, I mean, being on the board, being a treasurer for 5 years and staying on the board to do all the other board work as well can be a challenge. So recruiting can be hard, but I think when you have a healthy relationship with the head, you have a healthy environment, it's going to be a little bit easier. So that's all I've got in terms of content, and like to open it up for questions and answers.
So I just put a question. We had a great question about what's everyone paying for their audit. And I said it probably, it's a big factor of the size of the school, obviously, and the city you're situated in as well. I've seen some pretty wide ranges of fees, but I put in the chat box if folks are willing to share. Tell us the size of your school. So give us a feel for, are you one of our schools with 50 students, or you're one of our schools with 1,200 students? And what a rough estimate of what you paid for your last audit is. That would be some interesting information for participants. Here's a great question. What does the financial dashboard include? Mary Catherine, I know we have a webinar on that. Do you want to kind of talk about that?
We do have a webinar. Yeah, we do have a webinar, and I cannot express enough how critical a financial dashboard is to a school. It includes what we would hope for is at least a 10-year history of items such as enrollment and compensation, and kind of what your revenue was and what your expenses have been. And it includes all kinds of things over a period of 10 years, 5 to 10 years, hopefully, where you can watch for trends year after year. Number one, it helps you with planning. It helps you see kind of areas that you need work on. And we did that. We did it with, Rick did it for years for us. And he does it for, he doesn't anymore, but he created opportunities. A lot of people do dashboarding, but what Rick taught me to do is to do specific things that were related to schools, as opposed to things that might be related. We don't produce widgets. We have enrollment, which is what produces our revenue. And so a dashboard is really just being able to take a 50,000 foot look at the history of where you've been and where you're going, so you can see trends. And we're going to be doing that. So what we'll do in that dashboard webinar is we'll talk the first hour, typically talk the first hour about budgeting and going into detail about budgets. And then we'll talk, the second hour will be around how to create a financial dashboard and what the different parts of a financial dashboard are.
So we got some good information coming through the chat. So thank you. If you don't mind continuing to share your size of the school and what you're paying for an audit. And as you'll see, even with this group, there's a pretty wide
Yeah.
pretty wide variance.
For sure.
So we'll leave it open for a few more minutes. Mary Catherine, thank you
You
for this
bet.
presentation.
It's my pleasure.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. So if you're joining us by recording, thank you so much.